And joining us now on the debate in New York, New York, Rey Han, policy advisor at the economic think tank Economics 21. And here in studio, Mark Fetterman, educator and blogger at What is the Next Message? Tony Keller, visiting fellow at the Mowat Center for Policy Innovation at the University of Toronto, and of course a contributing Agenda Insight essayist. And we welcome back Chris Hedges, author of Death of the Liberal Class. And this is the part where you have to sit there and take it for a bit now.
I'm ready.
You gave it good, now you got to get it good. Okay, Rey Han, you listened to the interview. We should just explain to everybody, you've got a phone up to your ear right now because we're having some technical issues coming out of New York. We're doing the best we can. You heard the interview. Go. What do you want to say?
I did. I have a great deal of respect for Chris Hedges as a writer, reporter, and thinker, but I have to say I got the strong impression that we were living on different planets. Perhaps he'd agree with that sentiment. There were many things I took strong exception to. And just to give you my priors, my family's from the developing world. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. I like to think that I've had a pretty broad experience of the world and a pretty broad experience of the United States. And I definitely do not see an immiserated working and middle class. I do not see institutions that have been corrupted by corporate power. In fact, I see an economy that is in pretty bad shape at the moment, but that has a lot of virtues to it, and also a media culture that has a lot of virtues to it, a media that's grown more diverse, more inclusive, more participatory in many respects. One of the numbers that Chris Hedges threw out there was this idea that median wages have been stagnant since the 1970s. And it's interesting because the thing is that the median household has far fewer people now than it used to. And also when you include fringe benefits, when you include non-cash compensation, actually you see a very, very different picture. By that metric, living standards have increased considerably over that period of time. I just see a very, very different landscape. And again, don't take my word for it. Chris is a tremendously talented essayist and reporter. I just could not recognize the reality that I know from my daily life.
Okay, we'll come back to you in a second. Tony.
I'll give a related but different answer than Rey Han just gave. I feel like, imagine we're all restaurant reviewers and we all eat at the same restaurant and we're all not entirely happy with the restaurant. But our criticisms are a little bit different, and I think our solutions, our recommendations to the chef and the management are fairly substantially different. I think one of the things that I would criticize Chris Hedges for is I feel like there's an element of the presentation suggests there's a plot, there's a conspiracy, that everything is closely tied together. That's what I get from reading his work, and I don't see it that way. That said, I'm not going to sit here and suggest that everything about our society is perfect or everything about American society is perfect.
If there's a conspiracy, who's it among?
Well, I don't believe there's a conspiracy among anybody to do much of anything. And I also would say, we have to also consider the difference between the United States and the rest of the world, between Canada and the United States. That this is not sort of one unequivocal story, comprehensive story of disaster, failure, and democracy sliding away. There are things about American democracy that are problematic. There are things about Canadian democracy that are problematic. I guess we'll get a chance to get into that, but I would just say I don't see some sort of comprehensive plot, and I think, human history has mostly been a story of progress. It's not a story of unmediated progress. It's not a story of nothing but the line sloping upwards. But the line does tend to slope upwards.
Mark Fetterman, what do you say?
I tend to agree with Chris that the liberal class is dead in the same way that I think modernity is dead. The liberal class, I think, is a post-Enlightenment structure that came out after the church lost its influence in Europe. A bunch of secular systems that took over the role of giving authority in society. And some of them held power and some of them opposed power, and we have this toing and froing. And as Chris said, for a long time the liberal class served as the relief valve for unmitigated corporate capitalist power. But now we're living in a different age, and so as the old styles of authoritative power are dying, so too is the balance, the liberal class. And what we're seeing now is the emergence of new structures, new interconnections. It's not a conspiracy, but rather it's complexity. And it's a complexity of people who previously didn't have voice, didn't have influence, who didn't have a way of saying what's valued as knowledge, how we govern, how we conduct our commerce. And all of these weird changes that we're seeing throughout society in terms of the intellectual property wars, the different ways of governance, the fact that people who didn't have voice now have huge megaphones that they can speak to the world, are all presaging tremendous structural change in the way our society is evolving and has evolved over the past 100 years.
Chris, let me give you a chance to speak to Rey Han on the first point he made, which is he believes he does not live in a country that has been corrupted by corporate power. You want to give him an example?
He needs to get out of New York a little more. I was just in Youngstown, Ohio. There are whole sections of the United States that are beginning to resemble the developing world. I just did a story on Camden, New Jersey for The Nation magazine, which per capita is the poorest city in the country. It's also the most dangerous. These post-industrial pockets have visited upon their residents unmitigated despair. In places like Camden, for instance, there is no supermarket. 100 open-air drug markets, over 1,500 abandoned buildings. We see this in Detroit. We see this in other parts of Michigan. We're in deep trouble, and the figures support my case. The fact that 40 million Americans live in a category in poverty, and another 50 million in a category called near poverty, that 1 in 8 Americans rely on food stamps, including 1 of 4 children.
Are you laying all of this at the immorality of corporate power? Is that why it's all happening?
Of course I am, because what we did is we destroyed the regulations that checked monopolies and corporate power. Antitrust laws not only serve as bulwarks to protect the marketplace, but finally to protect democracy as well. Okay, and we enter into a unchecked, unfettered capitalism, which, as Karl Marx understood, is ultimately a revolutionary force. And let me just finally add that, I never use the word plot or conspiracy. Those are not my words. But to somehow deny the power of these corporate forces and what they've done, I think, is to close our eyes to reality.
Okay, Tony, you want to take that conspiracy one back?
I don't know if I want. Well, look, all I can say is I haven't read everything that Chris has ever written, but I've read a fair bit of it. And maybe you never use the word plot or conspiracy, but you tie so many things together as if they are acting in a coordinated way, and I don't see it. That said, I don't want to be sitting here saying that our society is perfect, that the answer for all things is deregulation or the unfettered free market. But on the whole, look, our society has progressed primarily in the right direction for a long time. There are things that are problematic about our democracy, but I don't want to.
Do you read climate change reports?
Yeah, no, I mean,
we're progressing. We're destroying the ecosystem on which the human life depends for survival.
But we may be able to do something about that. We may be able to take action.
We're not doing anything about it. We shredded Kyoto at Copenhagen.
Well, the biggest problem we have is that we've got a number of countries, China, India, a bunch of developing countries that may not be able to get on board with us on doing anything about that. Well, and by the way, this is sort of, to me, sort of shifting.
But I mean, it's that idea of progress, which Ronald Wright did a nice job of obliterating in A Short History of Progress, and the philosopher John Gray has taken on. This idea of inevitable human progress is not supported either by human history or human nature.
I think the idea of progress is being defined very narrowly, Tony, by the corporate interests, that we increase money, we increase wealth, we take more resources and use them. That's not progress when we look at it in the wide range of progress in terms of human development, in terms of education, in terms of health, in terms of people being able to determine their own lives and not be controlled and manipulated by corporate interests. Yeah. Those are not indicators of progress except in a very narrow definition.
Okay, let me go back to New York and bring Rey Han in at this point. Rey Han, you heard an earlier assessment by Chris Hedges that suggested that Barack Obama was a huge disappointment. 2 years ago it was yes we can, today it's no you sure have not. What do you think?
If I may, I'd actually like to just go back to one little point about Chris Hedges' poverty statistics. It's important to recognize that those poverty statistics do not factor in the earned income tax credit. They do not factor in food stamps. They don't include the things that we use to mitigate poverty in the United States, and so that gives you a somewhat different picture. Another thing is that when you look at the consumption of the folks living
in the bottom 10th or bottom third of the population, actually the consumption is twice as high as the reported income, in part because you have asset limits tied to various social welfare programs, so there's an incentive to collect so-called gray income, informal income. Let's say you're a father who is a non-custodial father, and you will see your wages garnished if you work over the table, so to speak. You then work under the table a lot of the time. So unfortunately, we're not getting the most accurate picture of the world through those statistics at times. Now,
No, let me give, hang on, hold that thought for a second there. Hang on, Rey Han, because before you go on to the next point, I should give him a chance to respond to that. He's saying your stats are not right.
Well, those are, no, he's conceding that the stats are right. He's just saying that they don't represent an accurate picture. And look, I've just spent a lot of time, both for the last book and for the current one, traveling around into these post-industrial pockets to somehow pretend that that kind of despair
and
physical...
I've traveled too. I'm from a post-industrial pocket, but just to throw it out there.
Where?
I'm from East Flatbush in Brooklyn.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that we are reconfiguring our society physically in a way that is creating a form of neo-feudalism where the upper third serve as a kind of managerial elite and the rest form a permanent underclass. Our unemployment statistics are completely fictitious, courtesy first of Reagan, who included 1.5 million of the armed forces within the unemployed stats to magically reduce the unemployment rate by 2%. Clinton threw people who had stopped looking for work or had poorly paid part-time jobs. For instance, the average worker at Walmart works about 28 hours a week, but their wages put them below the poverty line, and yet they're counted as unemployed. And to somehow deny that this kind of travesty has been unleashed with liberal collusion against the working class in this country is really a really disturbing form of fiction.
Okay, let him come back. Rey Han, come on back.
Well, okay, here's the thing. I'm not going to call what you're saying a disturbing form of fiction. I think it reflects your real, considered view of the world, and I respect that. What I will say is that there have been lots of regional shifts throughout American history. It is something that happens. It's a part of economic transitions, and it is tragic and difficult to see, particularly if you come from a depressed community. But it's something that happens really historically across societies. If you look at, for example, Sweden, a society that in many respects has a very admirable social welfare system. It's not what I would choose necessarily, but I think that there are some good qualities to it. 1/5 of all prime-age adults in Sweden are on disability at any given time. I think that the real problems in our society, in my view, are the large number of people that we incarcerate. There are problems that affect, kind of when you look at family structure, there are problems that affect a discrete slice of the population. But I think when you're talking about the immiseration of the middle class, I don't think that's an entirely fair characterization. So yes, you do see a deindustrialization of Camden, of Detroit, cities like it. But the thing is that those cities have also been depopulated. Detroit, at its height, had a population well in excess of 2 million people. Now its population has dwindled below 800,000. If you look at Washington, D.C., similarly, these are areas where middle class African Americans have left to move to inner suburbs, which, by the way, aren't perfect either. There are lots of problems there, too. But this is the kind of volatility that has always been a part of particularly North American societies. And so those transitions that you see are really snapshots of a moment in time.
Okay.
Consider also that 12% of the U.S. population is foreign-born. And of that foreign-born population, you have a large influx of folks who have the equivalent of high school educations or less. This is a very large number of people. And again, if you take a snapshot, you see poverty. But when you look at these folks over time, they are making palpable progress. Indeed, within their own lifetimes, they're making progress.
Okay, Rand, let me jump in here if I can.
The poorest country in the world. And I mean, these are some of the folks who are making progress.
Let me jump in here if I can, because I do want to get back to the Obama issue. Mark, I'll get you first on this. In our conversation earlier in the program, Chris almost made it sound, tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, like Obama has turned out to be a traitor to your liberal democratic ideals. Do you see it that way as well?
I'm not sure how I see it.
He didn't contradict me, so I think
one could read the current so-called failure of Obama in implementing all of his promises as emblematic of some of the dysfunction of the American system of government. That because of the contention, because of the requirement to get influx of corporate money and donor support to be able to run for office, there are tremendous compromises that have to be made in what otherwise, in my opinion, would have been good legislation if it was not eviscerated, like the health care bill, for example. On the other hand, the reality of the fact that I think both parties are controlled somewhat by corporate interests, by very particular
Well, you say
lobby
somewhat.
interests.
He says completely. You say somewhat.
I don't live in the United States, and I'm not intimate with the system, so I defer to Chris, and I don't want to make the absolute statement. But it sure seems that there's a tremendous amount of corporate interest that goes to funding the re-election and the election and re-election of any particular congressperson or senator.
Tony?
I think that part of the disappointment that many people may feel with Obama is because expectations were raised so high. Whether you're on the
By whom?
By him, by marketing, by the media, and by people themselves. I mean, we live in some ways in an age of perhaps exaggerated expectations. You know, the difficult work of politics, and this is something that Chris has actually written about. The difficult work of politics is a world of compromise and of hard choices and of us trying to come to an understanding of what to do. And Obama was kind of marketing magic, where a large number of voters were capable of looking at him and saying, "Oh, he'll fix it all. He's handsome. He's young. I like him. I react to him. He'll fix it all." This is illusory. This is delusional. The world doesn't work that way.
All that having been said, at the end of the day, is it a problem with your form of government, with the fact that he's only one branch of the government, that he couldn't come in and just change Washington to fit his desires? Is that the bigger problem here?
No,
for
the
you?
problem is that our form of government doesn't work anymore. What we have adopted is what Sheldon Willen calls a system of inverted totalitarianism, whereby, you know, unlike classical forms of totalitarianism, which seeks to overthrow a decaying structure, inverted totalitarianism finds its expression in the anonymity of the corporate state, not in a demagogue or charismatic leader. So that the Constitution, fealty to electoral politics, all of this remains. And yet the levers of power have been so corrupted by lobbyists, by money, by corporate interests, by campaign contributions, that we as the citizenry have been disempowered. And that is the problem. And Obama is a very intelligent man. He knows how power works. He knows what he has to do in order to serve power, just as Bill Clinton did, and that is what he has done.
Rey Han, can I ask you to comment on inverted totalitarianism and whether you see it the same way?
I think Sheldon Wolin is a very important thinker. I was also a great admirer of Murray Edelman when I was a younger man, and the idea of democratic politics as a form of theater. I think that these are interesting ideas, certainly. I don't think that they comport with my view of what's happening. I have a rather more modest view, which is certainly not entirely optimistic. My more modest view is that, just as Mansur Olson argued, when you have a stable society, there is an accretion of interest groups that become very effective at defending their interests. And I do think that Chris has a reasonable point there, particularly vis-a-vis, for example, the role of pharmaceutical companies and medical providers, et cetera, during the health reform debate. But I also think that, you know, this is something that it is inevitable in a stable society. We want a stable society. When I think about my own family's biography, the ways that they had opportunities blocked by civil war, by violence, by looting, et cetera, you know, I think that, you know, the pathologies of a stable society, I'll choose those over the pathologies of an unstable society any day of the week. And I think that actually there are things that are happening to civil society. There are tools. And when I talk about this, you know, advance of participatory technology, it sounds very naive and, you know, kind of woolly-eyed. But I do think that it's a way that we're going to increase the quality of democratic surveillance. So right now, we're at a moment when our public institutions are not working very well. Is it because of corporate power? Well, to me, corporations are basically congeries of individuals that sell things to other congeries of individuals and to individuals and households, et cetera. I don't see them as, you know, kind of in themselves noxious. But do I see interest group politics as a plague of many democratic societies? Definitely. Do I think that there are particular deficiencies of a system of government, you know, like ours versus, say, a Westminster system? Perhaps. I also think there's a virtue in that some kind of rash changes you know, are less likely to happen. Earlier during his presentation, Chris talked about civil liberties. And it's interesting because when you look at the state of civil liberties, for example, in Britain or France, particularly in Britain, when you look at the conflict with the IRA, during successive governments, civil liberties in that country by American and to a lesser extent Canadian standards eroded to a dramatic degree. They're actually much further along this process of erosion than we are. Yet I wouldn't describe you know, kind of modern Western European societies as totalitarianism. To be sure, I want to really stress that Chris is talking about Wolin's concept of inverted totalitarianism, which is very different.
Can I pick up on this?
But again, I think that there's, you know,
I want to pick
complex.
up on this because you did mention a stable society, and how much you enjoy that, and in which case, given that the main words of your Constitution are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and ours are peace, order, and good government, you should probably move up here, because we're very stable in that regard. And which raises an issue for me, Chris. Your comments clearly are aimed mostly at the United States, but how about the rest of the liberal democratic world? How are Canada, how are the rest of the world doing?
Well, you have a funny kind of coincidence where at the inception of the Iraq War, one of the preeminent liberal apologists for the war is now the head of your Liberal Party, Michael Ignatieff.
Yes.
And I've known Michael for many years, and I'm a great admirer in many ways of his work and his thought, but broke with him quite dramatically. In fact, on the day that the war began, we were both on National Public Radio, and I was speaking against the invasion and occupation, and Michael was defending it. And I think that in many ways, Michael becomes a kind of poster child for the failure of the liberal class to stand up to rapacious power elites. One of the greatest tragedies for me of the Obama administration is that it has codified this destruction of domestic and international law by the Bush administration. It really had a chance to restore the rule of law. Preemptive war, whether under just war theory or post-Nuremberg laws, is illegal. It is defined as a criminal war of aggression.
I think if he were here, he would say he supported that war, not to get too off topic here, but because he stood with the Kurds, that he'd done a lot of work covering their story.
So had I. Unlike Michael, I'd actually spent 7 years in the Middle East. I'm an Arabic speaker. Not only was I with the Kurds, I was in Basra during the Shiite uprising until I was taken prisoner and captured by the Iraqi Republican Guard. So I actually know a little bit more about it than Michael. And that is an absolutely specious argument, because while the Kurds were being gassed during Anfal, the United States was providing over $500 million in credits through Donald Rumsfeld to the Saddam Hussein regime during the Basra uprising. And remember that after the first Gulf War, First President Bush called on the Shiites to rise up, and they did. And I was in Basra during the uprising.
And then hung them out to dry.
And not more than hung them out to dry, permitted the Iraqi regime to put their helicopters up in the air, in which 30 to 40,000 Shiites were murdered while we stood by and did nothing. So this argument that he kills his own people, and it's true, and the one true fact George Bush told you about Saddam Hussein is that he really was as bad as they said he was. But this idea that he kills his own people, and that gives us a right to intervene. In a time of active genocide, I would agree. But that genocide was not only over, but we had a part, a complicitous part in ensuring its success.
Okay. Let's face it, that argument didn't work in Rwanda, right? Same logic. But Rey Han mentioned civil liberties, and whenever anyone mentions civil liberties as a virtue of our system, my mind immediately goes to the G20 here in Toronto, where back in June, where we saw just how fragile our civil liberties are in the face of potentially the liberal class, the middle class, the average people who were arrested illegally, who were detained illegally, who were assaulted by those people who are empowered to uphold the law. The rule of law was gone. I mean, habeas corpus being gone in the United States and not being reinstated by Obama is a travesty. But the fact that we have heavily armed police from all across Canada coming to wreak such havoc in the middle of Toronto on peaceful demonstrators tells us that there is something fundamentally being undermined in our entire system. We can carry on the illusion that all is right in democratic Canada, but we saw on that weekend just how fragile it is.
Just to come back to the Iraq War.
Oh no, we don't want to do that.
Yeah,
I want you to pick up on that.
You want me to pick up on that? Well,
because I'm the G20.
Yeah, but I want to come back to the Iraq War, because there's this whole, there's a presentation here that you have a group of liberals who backed the war, who believed in the idea of spreading democracy because they believe, they were either duped or wanted to help some corporate interests. I don't think that's...
I didn't say corporate interest.
Well, but I don't think that's... I don't think, however you put it, I don't think it's fair to Ignatieff or various other people who I think genuinely believe, they may have been wrong, the policy may have been mistaken, but these people genuinely believed that this was an opportunity to advance freedom in the world, to assist people who'd been living under a rather horrible system. We can argue that policy was a mistake, but I think the best argument against that becomes a kind of realpolitik conservative argument, which is there are some things you can't fix that are outside of your borders, and perhaps you shouldn't you shouldn't send yourself there to try to meddle in them. But I don't think that these people were motivated by malice. They may have been wrong, but I don't think it's malice.
They were useful idiots. They knew nothing about the instrument of war, and they knew nothing about...
Who are they useful idiots for? I mean, who's Ignatieff or Blair or anybody else?
They were useful idiots for people who propagated a war based on a non-reality belief system. The idea, and I can tell you, having spent months of my life in Iraq, the idea that we would be greeted as liberators by Baathists, the idea that democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and emanate outwards across the Middle East, the idea that the oil revenues would pay for the reconstruction, the idea that after we invaded Iraq, it could be put together as a unified country. Again, remember, Iraq is over as a unified country. That experiment following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire is finished. These people used massive amounts of force, what the philosopher Karl Popper always warned about, which was social engineering on a utopian scale. Over 1 million Iraqis are dead, 3 to 4 million are refugees. We're talking about tremendous amounts of human suffering. And it's very easy to be blasé about that suffering when you have not had to, as I have as a foreign correspondent, stand over the bodies. So to stand by and somehow say that they were well-meaning, well, I'm sure they were well-meaning, but they lent their moral credibility to a crime. And I think that they have a lot of blood on their hands because of it.
And the question is who benefited from that crime? Right. And who manipulated the government and the policy to actually undertake what, in retrospect,
and that's where I think you get into crazy talk.
I think you see. I think it's too easy to dismiss that as crazy talk.
One at a time, gentlemen. One at a time. You say it's crazy talk. You say cui bono. Who benefited?
Who benefited? There were tremendous corporate interests that benefited. I mean, take a look at how much went to Halliburton. Take a look at how much went to private contractors who managed to get their interest. How much benefited the global oil market with disruption in oil coming out of the Middle East. There's clearly financial benefit. One could say, oh, we didn't recognize it, it just happened, or one could say it was planned.
Okay. I'm going to bring Rey Han back in, and I'm going to do a bit of a hard turn here to get us back onto one of the points of the book.
Well, you can't do that
because you want to have your kick at it too.
Particular subject.
Okay, Rey Han, go ahead.
So I honestly I can't differentiate between who's saying what, but I'll just gently let you guys know that I disagree with some of the premises of what's being advanced. I'll also say that, do I think that the Iraq intervention was wise? I think the answer in hindsight is it was not. I will say, however, that in Bangladesh there was a humanitarian intervention. There were 1 million Bangladeshis were killed, and then India intervened. India intervened for a number of reasons. Not primarily humanitarian. They intervened on strategic grounds, but they likely prevented the slaughter of many more people. And so I think that the notion that humanitarian intervention might be a sound reason for intervening in that case, or some have argued, Noam Chomsky has argued that Vietnam intervened in Cambodia, and that was a sound humanitarian intervention. I think that there have been instances when humanitarian intervention has made a good, lasting, and positive difference. And I'll also say that I do believe, Chris said that the folks who advocated the war within the administration had a non-reality-based worldview. I can certainly say that there were many people in the administration who believed, wrongly as it turns out, that Iraq's regime had dangerous weapons of mass destruction. And I think that they, on relatively thin evidence, really did advance this idea, but I think that it was a sincere belief. Now again, as Chris says, that sincere belief doesn't justify the scale of destruction that's happened in Iraq since. But on the other hand, I think that this is a very kind of complex subject, and I sort of understand where Tony is coming from when he's saying that, look, we need to understand this through a broader lens when we're using it to kind of condemn a regime, the regime of the United States. I just think that it's important to take these things into account. I think that it was a catastrophic blunder, a catastrophic and expensive blunder that I think that the body politic has learned from. But of course, that's no consolation to many of the civilians who've died.
We are about.
Let me add something very quickly. Having been in Bosnia, in Sarajevo during the war, I support intervention to stop active campaigns of genocide. I supported the intervention in Bosnia. I was in Kosovo when the Serbs were carrying out their campaign of ethnic cleansing, and I supported that intervention, although not when it crossed the border into Belgrade and into Serbia itself. It was mishandled. But I think that is the difference, that the campaigns of genocide were over in Iraq. And having been in the middle of those campaigns, both with the Kurds and the Shiites, I would have liked intervention at the time that hundreds of thousands of people were being killed. But to somehow stand by over these mass graves and then justify intervention on their behalf is really cynical.
Okay, I'm jumping in here and dragging all of you kicking and screaming back to this text that we have tried to unpack over the course of the hour. Let's try this. Chris, to you first, and then we'll go around the table a bit on this. You've already told us what you think about the Republican Party. You also think the Democratic Party, in some respects, has broken your heart. The Tea Party is clearly not an alternative for you. You don't think they're going in the right direction. Your country is going to change a lot next week when the midterms take place. Where is the other, more preferable partisan option for people who think the way you do in the United States?
Well, part of my deep criticism of the liberal class and liberal institutions comes from the fact that I embrace the values they espouse. I care about them. I think they're important, and I think they're worth fighting for. And the failure on the part of liberal institutions to fight for those values means that we have ceded this anger and resentment, much of which I think is legitimate, to proto-fascist right-wing movements that frighten me, as well as the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party. And we are, no doubt, after these midterm elections, going to see some of that fringe begin to assume power. And I think that we who care about salvaging the democratic system and the democratic state have to begin to stand up and fight on behalf of these values, to gather our forces where we defend these moral imperatives and are not afraid to confront the Democratic Party when, including Barack Obama, when they walk out on these moral imperatives.
What's the vehicle to do it?
Well, the vehicle is the vehicle that has always been the correctives to democracy, and that is movements. The true correctives to a democratic system never achieve formal political power. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists for women's rights, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, none of them achieved formal political power, and yet they did what French workers are doing in the streets of Paris right now, and that is they are making their government afraid of them. And I think that, as Karl Popper said, the question is not how do you get good people to rule. That's the wrong question. Most people attracted to power are, at best, mediocre, which is Obama, and often venal, which is Bush. The question is, how do you stop the power elite from doing as much damage as possible?
Rey Han, you wrote the book, Grand New Party, Takeoff on GOP, the Grand Old Party. Obviously, Chris feels that the GOP is hopeless. What's your view?
Well, look, I mean, I come from what Chris would doubtless describe as the lunatic fringe. When I think of many people like Representative Paul Ryan, who are really trying to improve the way that public programs work in order to become more sustainable, when I think about the fact that so many American conservatives look to Paul Martin and are actively praising the kind of fiscal consolidation that happened in Canada in the mid-1990s, I have to say I just have a very different perspective on it. I think that when I think about the problems facing our government, I think of very basic problems of accountability and responsiveness. I think about all of the public employees, and both of my parents were public sector employees, who really want to do their jobs well but find themselves hamstrung. They want more autonomy. They want to be able to do their jobs well. And I just think that there are a lot of folks on the right who are pragmatic-minded, who want to help them do their jobs well, but who also recognize that you can spend endless amounts of money. State governments in our country until 2008 were growing at a clip of 6% a year. That was much faster than the broader economy. That was faster than household incomes. And I think that eventually that becomes unsustainable. So when I think about the Tea Party movement, you know, I have a different impression of it from many of our viewers tonight. I just think of a lot of people who think, gee, the country is going in this very unsustainable direction. I think it has to stop. A lot of these folks don't have very sophisticated understanding of public policy issues, just as a lot of people on the left don't. But they do have an inchoate sense that something has gone badly wrong. And I have to say I'm pretty sympathetic with that sense. And you know, sure, there are some people who say things that I find objectionable on this or that issue, but I do think that it's a healthy and constructive development.
Okay,
and so
I'm going to jump in there. Forgive me,
that mood behind the
Rand,
Tea Party is something I endorse.
We're down to our last few minutes, and I want to give you a chance to respond to that, you a chance, and then I want to give him the last word. Authors get that here. Okay, go ahead. 1 minute, please.
I think the Tea Party movement in the United States is a perfect example of how an oligarchic class is taking over and manipulating the emotions, the not so latent racist and general anger, frustration. They're able to rally a bunch of people, but the people at the top who are running the Tea Party are all wealthy, well-connected, privileged people who look to benefit themselves. And this is tremendously dangerous for democracy in America and democracy in Canada as well.
Tony.
I'd probably fall somewhere between Chris and Rey Han on this, in the sense that, look, societies go through these periods of change and upheaval, and in the 1990s it was the Democratic Party in the United States, the Liberal Party in Canada, the Labour Party in the UK, that essentially made a shift towards the center, towards the right, towards really accepting the market in ways that Chris will surely, does surely deeply disagree with, but that I think were highly beneficial. Currently, the Republican Party is going through a very deep shakeup in ways that at the moment I'm more scared by than heartened by. But we're going to see how it's going to play out.
Let me give you the last minute and a half to talk about Mike Bloomberg. Do you think he's an option? He's a potential third party to challenge the status quo.
He looks like he wants to run, yeah. And if he
Mayor
does,
of New York.
He's the mayor of New York, and he can self-finance.
So he doesn't need to suck up to corporate interests because he's already a billionaire.
He's already a corporation unto himself. Let me just talk, just briefly to this point of boom and bust. I mean, you're right. There are boom and bust cycles in capitalism. Anyone can draw a roller coaster graph in Economics 101. But when you destroy your manufacturing base, and when you reduce your working class to the service sector, where they can no longer get an income, where they can bring home enough money to support a family with benefits and a pension plan, then you create something that is outside of the usual paradigm. And having spent a lot of time in these post-industrial pockets, I think we have to recognize that we have moved into a new era, one where that is broken with this traditional boom and bust cycle, that we have reconfigured on a global scale a kind of horrific feudalism. When you read the reports of what workers go through in southern China, many of them are not even paid. At the end of the month, there's dozens of workers who climb up to the tops of buildings and threaten to jump themselves off if they're not given their paycheck. You can't even use Marxian terms about talking them as labor because they don't even get wages. That's what we're system. When we talk about making workers competitive in the global marketplace, we're talking about competing with prison labor. And that is the new paradigm that we have entered. So to talk about the old traditional economic systems that were tied to a manufacturing or an industrial-based economy no longer work.
And that is the last word today. Can I thank our guests, Rey Han Salam from Economics 21 in New York City. Apologies for all the technical problems off the top, Rey, but you went through it like a champ, and we appreciate you hanging in there for us. Chris Hedges, the author of Death of the Liberal Class, coming to a big bookstore near you soon, but he would prefer you bought it at an independent bookstore.
Yes, I would.
Mark Fetterman, organizational therapist. Tony Keller from the Mowat Center for Policy Innovation, a contributing essayist for The Agenda. Thanks so much, everybody. Great discussion.